What is it that you think about when you hear a word like rebel, or when you hear the word revolution, or even our title word this morning, revolutionaries? What do you think of? Some of the history buffs among us might go back to the French Revolution, and we might even think of some rather important and let's just say sometimes graphic details might come to mind. I'm not going to go into those, but you might think about Madame de la Guillotine, the French Revolution, the rebels. Or you might think more recently in this country, you might think about the 60s and the 70s and what were they called? The flower children. You might think about, and I'm not going to ask for raise of hands if any of you were there, but you might think about Woodstock. That might be the symbol in our culture of revolutionaries. People that are going against the grain, people that are going to be different to be different, the people that are a rebel with a cause, at least they think, even though I think the saying is a rebel without a cause, the people that are ready to do anything against the system, rebelling against the machine. Revolution. Does anybody in here like being a rebel? You can raise your hand on that one if you're rebellious enough to do so. Now see, the joke's on me. We got one up front. See, the rest of you are so rebellious, you won't even follow that instruction or that request. It was more of a request, all right? What if I told you that it can be not just a good thing, but it can be for the best for you, for me, for us as God's people to be rebels? Would you like that idea? Now, before we go too far, I am not trying to say this morning that you need to tap into some actual rebellious spirit and use that. I don't know that you'd want to necessarily use that as motivation to do what God says. But realize with me this morning, if you haven't, be reminded if you have, that it being in a culture like ours, faithful families, and that's your first word. We're not going to have a lot of words on the screen today. We're doing things a little differently, and so hopefully we can track together. If not, see me after the sermon. I'll make up some words later, and we'll fill in the handout. But that second line there, after what if I told you, in a culture that has rebelled already against God, and keep in mind that many of the things that happened that were against God in our culture 60 years ago, let's start thinking, wait a minute. Okay, yeah, roughly 60 years ago means that today, faithful, that's your key word there, faithful families are the true rebels against the grain of what is supposed to happen in our society today. So with that in mind, let's consider three areas of thinking this morning. They all touch each other quite a bit. There's some overlap here. It's about the idea of what it looks like to say no to a world that has a mold for us, to the little g God of this world, Satan. He has it all picked out for us. And right now, society is right there. How do you say no? That's what it means. It means saying no to a world that is chaotic. And that's your first overall line there, a chaotic culture. And then instead, consider with me a godly gift. And then last, let's have a radical resolve to be those who are, in a word, rebels for a real cause. When you think about that idea of a chaotic culture, you might picture in your mind, and use this as a visual aid this morning, you might picture a multitude, a group of people is what we'd say today, a big group, big crowd. And you meet them and they're all rushing toward one destination. And then you begin to realize they're all running off of a cliff. There's an old quote that says, when everybody is running headfirst toward the cliff side to rush and fall off the cliff, the few people that are walking in the opposite direction, they look like they've lost their minds. When in reality, it's the people, the group that's rushing off the side of the cliff that have lost it, have lost touch with reality, or, in our two words this morning, chaotic culture. Chaotic culture. Now, first you have the issues. And you can make your own personal observations. You can look at journalistic records. You can look at different movements. You can look at all the statistics you want. But what you will find are some of these overall ideas. You can use ism. There's lots of isms out there. It makes it an easy way to remember some of these. The overall might be secularism, where everything is being pushed away from anything that even resembles something related to God or biblical principles. We don't even hardly call them traditional values anymore. We call them judgmental and harsh, harmful, unhealthy values. How chaotic we've become. One of the new ones that has come on the scene, how many of you have heard of antinatalism? Antinatalism, anybody? Okay, see, it's pretty new, but it's where we are as a culture. If you're trying to put your finger on the pulse of the chaotic culture, antinatalism is one of the new ones. And if you think about the word natalism, and then you attach an anti to it, it are people that have decided it is for the best. And sometimes it is environmentally motivated, sometimes it is social, sometimes there are a lot of different things that are specifically a part of it. It's nuanced. But it is the decision that it is for the best to not have children. Now, I don't want this to be one of those sermons where you come away thinking the preacher says you have to get married and you have to have 10 kids. Okay, I don't have 10 kids. Somebody said I was going to have 75 kids, but she didn't know what she was talking about. Anyway, she was 10, okay? This is not one of those sermons where you have to be a faithful Christian and to please God, you got to get married and you got to have kids. Okay, there is a place for people that aren't married. There is a place for married people that don't have kids, might not be able to have kids on their own. I realize all of that, and I want to honor that, and people that serve in that capacity. Not every life is meant to be cookie cutter. But that's not to say that the overall is that people get married and they have kids. I mean, where would we be if nobody ever got married, and for sure if nobody ever had kids, right? But that's a part of our culture right now that says, and sometimes it's people that say the world's just too bad, there's too much cruelty, we don't need to add to that, and we don't need to bring kids into this world. And yet God has always seen children as a good thing. It's a blessing. Antinatalism. What about spiritualism? Did you know that's been on the rise the last 2 decades? Longer than that, but it's really seemed to ramp up the last couple of decades. Got to find a way to communicate with the other world. I got to communicate with my ancestors, or I've got to find somebody that can help me connect to the spiritual world, especially the world of the dead. And it's kind of become this subculture that is starting to rise above the surface. Spiritualism. Now, while we're talking about spiritualism, you could just take the word spiritual out of that. And there is a continual push in our culture away from any form of organized religion, regardless of what that looks like. And there's the saying that has almost become an old saying now. It's been around so long in our culture, and it's become a part of our culture. I'm what? I'm spiritual, not, somebody fill it in, religious. And I get some of that. Some of that people have been hurt by religious people. They've been confused by religious teachings. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But part of what happens is when you view things this way, one thing is it doesn't mean much. What does it really mean to say, I'm spiritual, not religious? Give me Jesus, don't give me the church. Or I believe in a higher power, but I don't really do the whole Bible and religious text and worship thing with people. I don't do that. I just have some thoughts and feelings about a higher power. I kind of try to live my life that way. Some people, I don't care at all. You could include Satanism, which that one sometimes gets kind of confused with people that actually worship Satan. That's usually a different thing. Satanism today is basically another word for atheism. They just tend to be more organized and active about it. That's where we are as a culture. And we've been reaping the seeds of some of these isms for a long time. Feminism. And I saw an observation recently where someone said part of what happened is even in the church, we saw the abuses of things like male leadership in the home. We saw domestic abuse. We saw overbearing dads. We saw wives that thought they weren't even allowed to speak unless spoken to. And then, same thing, we threw the baby out with the bathwater and decided there's no male leadership in the home. We're just parents doing this thing together in the church. And then we're beginning to reap the consequences of that. Fatherlessness is the epidemic in our culture. Loneliness. People that are realizing this whole independent thing, maybe that's not all it's cracked up to be. Anxiety. And this isn't adults anymore. This isn't teens anymore. Teen anxiety levels, teen hopelessness has been high for decades. It's now getting into our children. I mean, who would have thought there would be 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds that are being diagnosed with clinical anxiety? How does that happen? Now, I'm not here to say we've got all the answers and the problems, all those problems would be solved if we just had better nuclear families. But every study across multiple fields, I'm talking sociology, psychology, medicine, child development, and we haven't even got to the Bible yet. I don't mean to put the Bible last, okay? We're leading there. But all of those secular, to use that term again, studies keep coming to the same conclusion. That children are best when raised by their biological parents, who are married, by the way. Now again, we've got some here that are single parents. We've got people that have gone through different struggles with relationships. We've got some here that are what it used to be called non-traditional families. And we appreciate you and your work and your effort to do what you can as you are in certain circumstances. But once more, that doesn't mean that we say all of that is how it's supposed to be. That it's normal to have single homes, single parent homes, and fatherless children. It's not. It is in our culture. It's become the norm. It's become what we do. So let's open up the Bible for a moment. Look at Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, beginning at verse 18. Romans 1, verse 18. Look at the progression that the Apostle Paul writes about. He starts in verse 18 about the wrath of God that's been revealed from heaven against unrighteousness and people that restrict or hold back the truth in their unrighteousness. They don't want to live it. They don't want to hear it, we might say in our words today. And so he begins to describe how the evidence for God is clearly seen in what has been made, verse 20. He says in verse 21, although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. And you'll see this a couple of times in this passage. If you look at verse 26, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged the natural relations of those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, verse 28, God gave them up to a debased mind. And then you have a whole litany of sins and behaviors that are against God and his good creation. And we've been seeing these kind of consequences in our society for a long time now. And sometimes people will point to things like homosexuality and its prevalence and say, well, God's going to punish us for that. And yet Romans 1 says that in one sense, when that becomes a part of your culture, that is a kind of punishment because God gives you up and lets you have at it. He lets you have your way when you say my way, not your way, to God. And that's not where we are. It's where we've been as a culture for a long time. Some of us may have just kind of got used to it. And so in that last line there, underneath chaotic culture, it's when this is what happens. It's chaos is the natural result. Whenever we as a culture rebel against God's good, and that word there is order, order. Did you notice that even in Romans 1, that there's an emphasis on what is supposed to be? There's an emphasis on why wouldn't you worship the God who's the creator God? And instead, things happen that are unnatural. Virtually everything we do that is a rebellion against God is a rebellion against the way we were created, the way God's order in the beginning was made. That's why it's unhealthy. That's why it ends up hurting us. That's why we end up lonely and depressed. Again, I'm not trying to clinically diagnose, okay? That's a different topic. I'm speaking broadly as a culture. We have a problem with hopelessness because we don't have hope in God. A chaotic culture. Now, before we move on to the more positive part, I thought this summary was well put together. And this is by someone that was looking into some of these studies. They say, in spite of all evidence to the contrary, people insist that sexual license has no consequences, that divorce is liberating, that children are better off without both their biological parents, that a child can be raised by a man and his homosexual lover just as well, that marriage is oppressive unless it is between two people of the same sex, that biological sex isn't reality, that, quote, gender is whatever a person thinks in his mind. We didn't specifically mention that one earlier. Gender fluidity is what we're calling it now. We've been calling it for a few years. I think we're up to about 100 different supposed genders. Most people say it's just infinite. But this quote goes on and says that gender is whatever a person thinks in his mind, and that anyone who won't play along is a hateful bigot. And I might add here, that's about the best insult. I've heard a lot worse. And finally, they conclude many other bizarre fantasies. People running off the side of a cliff. A chaotic culture. But now, the good part. Here you might think about blueprints. As you turn your attention and your mind more to what God did in his creative work. How God set things up. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of the word institution when applied to some of these, but in this context, it kind of works. What's the first institution, if we're going to use that word, that God made? Was it government? Judy already answered. I didn't. You were supposed to think about it. No. It was the home. See, she didn't even give me a chance to ask my rhetorical questions. Was it the government? Was it the church? None of those. It was the home. That's why on your handout there you have Genesis chapter 2, 18 through 25, when God created the first home. He did so by creating the first marriage. And so we could kind of put a forward slash there. The first thing God created of this sort was a marriage/home that would lead to children. That's how God made things. And it was one man, I should say, and one woman. Intended for what? For life. That's how the Creator created our world. Not long after he created the world itself. Or look with me at Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. Hebrews 13, verse 4. God's gift to us is one where we honor marriage. Where marriage is not seen as oppressive. Where sexual behavior, I like how someone put it recently, it's seen as a recreational drug, and the only license on it is consent, and some of that's already being pushed back against, by the way. But instead, the godly gift is a marriage of two people who love Jesus and therefore love each other. Hebrews 13, verse 4 is how God looks at it. He says, let marriage be held in honor among all. It's based on the blueprint God gave. And let the marriage bed be undefiled. You could take our title word here, or our subtitle here, godly gift, and put it in this and say marriage itself, the marriage bed. Yes. I haven't used the word in a little while. I used it earlier in a different context, but marital sex is a godly gift. And we like to kind of just push it to the side, and we don't want to talk about it. It makes us uncomfortable. Yeah, God talks about it a whole lot. Now, we have a culture, and I'm going to have to feed back here for just a moment. We have a culture that wants no shame, no blame, and no pain. Just keep everybody comfortable and don't shame anything. And yet God says, here's marriage, hold it up. And then the last part does say then, and God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Marriage within God's design is honorable. It's something you get to be a part of. Not something that at one time you felt like culture forced you and you were a rebel when you didn't get married and you cohabitated, so we eventually started calling it, or you just didn't really have any relationships at all because it's just me and maybe some one-night stands. God says this covenant, loyal, loving, caring, growing together, raising children together possibly, if that's to be, this is something you need to hold up and you need to praise it. You need to recognize it. Now, it's not without its struggles, and you could go ahead and kind of look down at the bottom part of that. It's not without its struggles, without its obstacles. And again, sometimes things like this are taken and abused and used on people. But what did we say a minute ago? What we don't do, we don't throw out everything good just because of some failures that people have when trying to do what is God's design. And how does God see it when a man and a woman have children? We already gave it away in one way. But what would you put there? That third line under godly gift, that children are all right, see, y'all are too good this morning, okay? Somebody was supposed to say burden or problem or headache or something, okay? And we're not ignoring reality here, and we don't want to say that there's not ever, as we said, there are problems even within, if you had the ideal nuclear, quote, traditional family, it's always going to be problems because you got people in that home. But ultimately, might that be how we put it? Ultimately, children are a blessing. Isn't that what Psalm 127 says? Look at that one. There's that first line, the opening line, that unless the Lord builds the house, those who work labor in vain. And you can take that to be about a physical structure of brick and mortar, or given some of the context of the rest of this psalm, you can apply that more to home life. But it's in verse 3, or the third line of this song, when the Holy Spirit has the writer record, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb, a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks, even here with his enemies in the gate. What if we saw children as a blessing, not a burden? Not just some possible part of our lives. And here I'm not just talking about being parents, because this is about how we see things as a people, as a culture. So this isn't just about our own kids or whether we have kids or not. It's not about even whether we're married or we get married or we've been divorced or what. It's about how we see things. The godly gift is that this is how God created things. And when things are working as they should, when things are natural and normal, this is what it is. But as we started, this has become the rebellious thing. To get married early, to have children, and to live together faithfully to each other, even more because you're living faithful to Jesus and encouraging and teaching and training children to do the same. That's the rebellious thing to do in our culture. You want to start a revolution? Get married and have kids. By the way, if you have kids, then that means you're back to the marriage bed in Hebrews 13:4. And then you have the respective roles that God created. Here we might go to Ephesians chapter 5 and start about verse 22 and then go through chapter 6, verse 4. When husbands, wives, parents, specifically fathers and children are all addressed by God to His church. To the local church that received that letter, to us as we receive it today and read it. And husbands are instructed to love their wives like Jesus loves the church. Wives are instructed to submit to their husbands the way the church should submit to Jesus. Children are told to obey their parents. Fathers are told to bring them up in the discipline, in the teaching, in the instruction of the Lord. Nowhere in here or anywhere in the Bible do you get the idea that you can go through this thing called family and home in some haphazard way. Now, at the same time, I don't want this to be viewed. We don't want to view this as just some mere responsibility. I saw a discussion the other day between some men, and they were discussing whether you should even say that, well, I have to provide for my family, and whether that made it sound like you were guilt-tripping your family. And one spoke up and said, what if we viewed it as I get to love and enjoy and, yes, provide, however, this ain't just about finances, right? Provide what is needed for a healthy home. To love and cherish your wife. By the way, wives are also told to love their husbands, okay? Don't it's a different passage. To love, and yes, to submit to the leadership of your husband. Does that mean we can't talk this out? Does that mean that, well, no. One of my favorite words is let's. Let's do this. To borrow our modern vernacular, let's go to church this morning as a family. A godly gift. And what does that bring? If you want to finish that last line there, it brings stability and blessing. And there's the saying, as goes the home, so goes the nation. We don't have to wonder. Once more, this just like the psychological side, there's more to it than this. We don't want to be too narrow in our view here. But we don't have to wonder as a whole why our country is so messed up and mixed up and confused and anti-God. So much of it goes back to the home. And when homes are in chaos, the world follows. Instead, God has given us something so good, so secure, and so healthy. Now, here's the last one this morning. You can look at this as the person that has rushed off the side of the cliff and now realize they don't like the landing. Now, you got to be very metaphorical, okay, because somehow you still have your bones aren't broken enough that you can still then get back up and climb back up the cliff. But this is about the effort it takes to go upstream, to climb the cliff, to go against the grain, to be called a fool, narrow-minded, judgmental, bigoted, whatever. Worse. because you have a radical resolve. Not just to do what's right, but a radical resolve to follow God. And that you can put that into these different slots here, raising up a faithful generation. Because it's one thing to be faithful to God ourselves. It's one thing to obey the gospel and become a Christian. But what if our kids don't learn the gospel? Or what if they learn it from a different source that may not even be the pure gospel? Or they learn the gospel that Satan has for them. They begin to... Instead, what if we raised up a faithful generation? What if we followed Deuteronomy 6? God gave the ancient Israelites, he says, here's your handbook for parenting. You start by knowing the one God and loving Him with all that you are, and then wherever you are, whatever you're doing with your children, keep in mind you got to spend time with them to do that, you teach them. And sometimes that's words that come out of your mouth. More often, that's your actions, your attitude toward Jesus, toward the church, toward integrity and honesty, toward whatever specific circumstance. And you resist. It's a resolve to resist the pull of the world. Partly, I used the word mold a moment ago because of Romans 12, 1 and 2. It tells us to be transformed, not conformed, or not molded. You think about melting down something like silver and pouring it into a mold. So instead of you could have some fun here with the words and say, instead of being poured into the mold that Satan and society already has prepped for us, resist that pull and realize this morning, here's that third line here, realize that although doing that, making the decision now to do whatever it takes, whatever cost, to follow Jesus, to love Jesus with all your heart, radical resolve that doing that won't be easy. Not always. You're going to have to make some hard calls. You're going to have to do things that people are going to say is hateful, not loving, when they don't even know the definition of love. You're going to do things, and your children may even say, I hate you. Now, fun point here. It was at a Kmart. This would have been about 1997. And they used to have the restaurant. You know, they got McDonald's and Walmart's. They had this other, I don't even remember what it was called now. It was another burger joint in Kmart's in Huntsville, Alabama. And somebody here this morning, the only person I can see right now standing up, said those immortal words to their mother. I hate you. I said it, okay? Just in case you were still wondering who I'm talking about, okay? You know what she said? She said, okay, I still love you, and you're still not going to do that. That's what she said. Now, I later recanted those words. It's not always going to be easy. What should that last line be? And part of it is borrowing from 1 Peter 4, where he says they're gonna malign you. That's a fancy way of saying they're gonna think you're a fool for not running off the cliff with them. But it is always worth it. And it may not be that it feels like that when you're in the trenches, whether you're at the house or you're out at the ball field or wherever you are, you're driving down the road on that long road trip and you've heard, are we there yet for the 100th time? It may not always be easy, especially in the moment, but it is always worth it. For sure, you'll realize that later. We've seen these three this morning. A chaotic culture. And the world does not need more just noise. It does not need more confusion. It needs the godly gift of saying, God is the creator. Just maybe, we probably should be a little more confident in that, but facetiously, just maybe he knows what he's doing. Maybe we should listen. maybe we should radically resolve. I'm not saying you should do this. We don't have this in our house, but it'd be one of those, like on the movie Courageous, it'd be one of those, you could print it out and put it like a plaque on the wall. We're resolving as a family. I'm resolving as a father, a mother, that although we're not going to always do it as we should, and we're going to hurt each other at times, and we're going to sin against each other, that we are resolving now that God will be worshiped, that God will be served in this house. And we're not talking about four walls anymore. What if we did that? We could play the numbers, and that's beside the point. What if every member of God's church resolved to do that? Because let's not be naive and think that's already happening. It's not, it hasn't. But can you imagine what impact, still as the minority, but what impact that would have? Most revolutions are started by a minority, a small group. Now, I'm not saying we take up arms like in 1800 in France or in the 1770s. I'm saying we take up the sword of the Spirit and we, in a way, rebel against Satan and against a chaotic culture. Now, this is not one of those sermons that easily lends itself to an invitation. I mean, I could make it really blunt and say if you haven't been what you should be, and as a parent, as a husband or a wife, then you need to come forward. I don't know, you might need prayers for your home today. You might need today to say, I'm not even someone, I haven't obeyed the gospel yet. I haven't repented of my sins myself and put on Jesus in baptism. I need to do that and lead my home to be home one day with Jesus. Or it might be today that I already have, but I resolve. In whatever situation I have, regardless of how things may already be or not be broken or confused, or that I'm going to resolve to be a revolutionary for Jesus. As we stand and sing together.